So in this video, I'm going to show how I went from a Twine HTML choose your own adventure game to a printed choose your own adventure game book. So there are times when you automate for long-term good reasons, and there are times when you don't automate and wish you had. And because I've just converted all my websites to a static HTML format, and I really wish I had automated that process better. When I was coming to convert this game, which we wrote in Twine, to experiment with creating it as a choose your own adventure book where it says go to passage 8, go to passage 10, those kind of things, which Twine really doesn't output by itself. When you can see an example here. Here's an example, go to 11. So we're clicking that, we go to 11. And I could read this out as a book if I wanted to, or I could do it online in an ebook. And I've still got access to the initial HTML based game. The game itself is less important. What's important is I need to somehow convert to this automatically. And I started going through the HTML that it generates. It's fairly simple. For each passage in the text, we've got an ID, we've got a name, we've got this tag, this TW passage data. And really what I want to do is pull out all of those, put them in a separate file like this, and parse these links so that they become markdown links with internal references. And I could do that manually. I could do that manually for this to experiment with and see what happens. But I thought this will be a good exercise for demonstrating some JSoup and demonstrating how I approach tactical work and turn it into strategic work. So the basic thing is we have this file. I want to extract out this and I want to automate that, and I want to automate that in a tactical way. Now this example is a fairly simple one. This was output by the earliest version of Twine. This is the version that is output by the most recent versions of Twine. So you can see there's a lot of stuff in here that is irrelevant, but embedded within there are still the TW passage data stuff and the end part. So really I just want to pull out all of those and parse it. Because I have no idea how well formatted this file is, and because in order to put this through an XML processor, I'd probably have to trim out the head stuff first and do extra processing. I didn't really want to go down an XML processing route. So I'm using JSoup. Let me show you JSoup. I like JSoup. It handles malformed HTML. It handles XML. It's very simple parsing. I can bring it into the project through Maven. It's very easy to work with. If I go on a download site, we can see the actual Maven code. The documentation is very useful, and it allows me to create very simple code. So let's have a quick look. If I show you the history for the test file, local history, show history, and I go back to yesterday, this was a pretty big file, and I didn't put this into version control, so I've extracted it from this local history command. Now this is not nice code. Basically, as I was writing it, I was thinking through the process. This is what I do when I automate tactically, right? I think through the process, I'll add some comments in here as to what I'm doing, and I will just write the code and see if it works. Because I'm experimenting. I have no idea whether this is a good way to automate or not. I have no idea whether JSoup is going to work or not. So I'm not going to TDD my code. I'm just going to write code that is simple enough and seems to do the job in very small, simple chunks. So the first thing I have to do is I have to take one of those archive files that you just saw and read it in. And I'm using JSoup to do that. So I'm basically going JSoup, read in this file, there it is, and parse it. And at that point, I can then access the things in JSoup as though it were a DOM. And in JSoup, I want to get every element that has this tag. That's nice and simple. JSoup goes and does that. I can loop over the elements that it finds. In JSoup, I can then say I want to get the attributes for the PID and the name. Let's look in the text for those. So you go see each one of these TW passage has a PID and a name. They're just attributes on that XML tag, so I can get those off as though it was HTML. Now, one of the things that JSoup doesn't do particularly well is getting the actual raw text, because JSoup is designed to parse HTML, and white space and new lines are not important in HTML. So JSoup traditionally doesn't give you them back. So I had to hunt a little bit to find the text nodes to actually find the functionality to do that. But having found that, I was able to pull out the information we want. I've got another video showing how we use evaluate and debug mode to explore an API to find functionality that we want. So I'm not going to cover that in detail here. Then I can go through and I just normal HTML at this point, or normal Java processing. I'm working through a set of elements, I'm pulling data off, and I've put them into an object. Where possible, even when working tactically, I will create objects to store data. Rather than put it in arrays local, I'll create custom objects. It helps make the tactical automation that I'm writing a little bit more explainable. I'm refactoring gradually into domain objects. So a twine passage essentially represents that block of text that you saw with an ID, a name, a body text. And then I do extra things on it where I parse the links. Now parsing the links is slightly different. Let me show you. So the links in here are not Markdown, it's not HTML, it's a custom format. But what I basically did is I went into a regular expression tester, pasted in this example of a link and wrote a regex to parse it. Then I could come back into my code and I could use the regex to parse it. Basically at this point I'm going through the text and I'm saying, if the line starts with this, then it's a new passage link and store those. Otherwise, it's a normal text link. And for the passage links, I have another parser in here that takes this regex and matches it to get the groups. So I get the name and the other part, the ID that it's linking to. This is all very simple. I refactored to all this code, just chunking it through, thinking through the process bit by bit, trying to take code out of here where it makes sense. But I've still got big blocks of code. I've written some debug code to output to the console just so I see what is happening. Then I do some magic to output it into a markdown format, and that's it. In fact, I'm not really using much Java 8 file functionality because I'm relying on the JSoup to read the file. So that's nice and simple. Having created this tactically, I've got a big long set of text. What I then do is I go, right, so really all of this twine passages are part of a story. So what I really want to do is create a story. Let's see if I can find that point in the local history. So at this point in the code, I have a set of passages and they are loose. It's stored in the text here, just a list of passages. Really, I have a story that has a set of passages. So what I do is I create the concept of a story. Then I start to move this list of passages into the story. So at this point, I've just created a story. The passages are still loose. So then you can see I've started to use the story. So what I've done is I've created some methods on the story like story.setAuthor, setTitle, story.addPassage. And then later on, I use the story.passages. So I moved most of the passage function into story. I haven't moved this into the story because this essentially is a Twine file reader. So in order to get rid of this, I have to create a Twine SuperCube reader. And then I've got a load into method. And I've basically just created this method and moved all that code that you just saw into this method to load in the story. So I've got the reader, I've got my story object, I load the file into the story, and this is where all that code that we saw previously has just been essentially copy pasted in here because I did the work to refactor out story first before moving into other areas. And the point I'm showing you this is you can start tactically with fairly long, horrible code, just thinking it through. As you refactor it into objects, and as you do that, try and get objects that are single responsibility, you can gradually build up a tactical set of objects. So the end result is I have a fairly simple set of code. So this is hard coded. At some point this will be moved out into properties or something, or a command line. I create a file for that. I have a reader I have a story. I read the file into the story. I reorder the passages in the story. Then I have something that takes the story and outputs it to a set of files. That's different classes with different responsibilities. The story manages the passages, knows how to pull the links out. In fact, the passages themselves know how to parse the links. Set of objects with single responses that I've strategically refactored to from some fairly horrible tactical code. That is the way that I like to approach experiments. I refactor rather than think too far ahead. What I would want to do now is wrap this stuff round with unit tests. Because I didn't create it in a test-driven way, I want to go back and make sure that I TDD this. Because I can see here that I have the parsing start when I do get link text, but not when I do get link name. So if I do this out of order, I know this is going to crash. And I know that I need to wrap this with tests in order to generate that code. So there's changes I still need to make, and I can make those changes with TDD because I have now demonstrated that this code that I've written is actually useful. This split of objects is useful and works well. JSoup is good enough to continue going forward. But JSoup, I could pull it out and use different libraries if I wanted to. JSoup was my tactical choice for getting something up and running fast. And I can move that out later on if I want, but tactically this will work fine for what I'm doing, and it's a low overhead library. So that's just some insight into how I move from tactical to strategic work. And the way that, by the way, I haven't really gone into detail on the Markdown thing, but the way that I generated the PDF is I use another tool that I've written called Pandokifier, which you can find on GitHub, that takes a set of Markdown files and a book.txt in the same way LeanPub does, and generates PDFs using Pandoc. And also the code for this is also on GitHub in my CYOA repository, Choose Your Own Adventure repository. So you can find all the code for this online anyway.